think we are live on LinkedIn for the first time. So I'm just going to take a few seconds to let the notification hit some people. But I promise I won't take too long because I think most people are going to see this afterwards anyway. I'm going to take this out because otherwise I'm going to hear myself with a delay from the LinkedIn Live. If you have questions during this live podcast, then feel free to put them in here on LinkedIn. I'll try to see if I can answer them. Apart from that, let me introduce the show. So this is the live People and Culture show. We'll be discussing different topics related to people, culture, the workplace, managing performance, managing well-being, and have a lot of emphasis and focus on leadership as well. As it says in the post, the topic of this is going to be stress and mental health, because NFA, the Danish National Science Center for like the workplace or work environment, has published a new report on stress. We'll get back to that in a second. First, let me introduce myself real brief. So my name is Christian. I'm one of the co-founders of Soyas. Soyas is a leadership tool that really dives into people and culture and leadership with a data-driven purpose to help both HR, people and culture teams, executives, but especially also managers navigate how to be a good leader. And this will be available afterwards on YouTube as well as on most of the podcast streaming devices that you're used to using. So, and what will the format be? I anticipate doing this quite agilely and actually taking up themes if I have something I want to comment on. Something we've been discussing internally, something that I think would be useful to the public to hear more about. But I will also bring on guests. So you can look forward to me being joined by others in other episodes, where we'll also have the perspective of other experts, specialists on different topics. I think that is it. I expect this live to be somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. Depends on the questions as well. And from what I can tell, we do see that in the comment that people can see and hear me. So that's a good start. All right. Stress is a big topic and also a topic that we experience. There is a lot of scare around even talking about. A comment we often get when speaking to potential customers using our platform is they're actually afraid to measure stress because of even bringing up the topic could have a negative effect on people's well-being and mental health. And we'll get back to whether that is the case or not, but it's certainly a topic that's been more taboo previously than this today. And the public sphere is demanding more conversation around this, which is quite natural as things are not progressing in a positive direction, but more trending towards worse and worse mental health, both in the workplace, but certainly also privately and certainly for the younger generation. But going back, so NFA, it's a Danish association for doing scientific research within the workplace environment. And they published a new study that dives into what are the costs to businesses related to stress. And they divide it into several topics. I'll try to see here if I can be accurate with some of it next to me. So it costs a small country like Denmark with around a workforce of around 3 million people. It costs 16 billion Danish kroner a year, which is equivalent to a little over 2 billion euros, to put that into perspective for all the people who are from other countries. And the vast majority of that is related to sick leave. There is also roughly little over like 25%-ish that is due to loss of productivity, and around 5-7% that is because people actually have to take prolonged sick leave. So not just a day or two here and there, but prolonged sick leave. So the vast majority is the sick leave that isn't accounted for by days here and there, not something that is prolonged to that degree. At least that's how I read the report. And I previously told journalists during an article if I remember correctly, sick leave is roughly equivalent to 7 great prayer days. If that makes any context, at least for the Danes, Great Prayer Day is no longer a national holiday because we needed to actually increase the amount of working hours during a year to keep BNP and the economic engine in a high enough gear. So it's interesting that just by lowering stress by 15% ish, we'd be able to cover a full working day like that as well. So it's certainly an area that, from a even like a public perspective, should be of great interest. So 16 billion Danish kroner, that's a lot. It's hard to put into perspective. I think it's more interesting to discuss why is that happening? How can we solve it? What are they proposing as good solutions for this? And how I might see things a little differently. So I do have an agenda next to me. So when I'm looking down, it's just to make sure that I'm not going completely off track. So it is bad. And I think we can all recognize that it's going in the wrong direction. We have plenty of stats and statistics and research and studies to prove that. And I think we all admit that stress is at a bad point, but it's also interesting at the same time to at least discuss whether people are fully taking that in. Because when we speak to head of HR, when we speak to executives, founders, managers, there seem to be very little realization that it's happening under their roof as well. We can't all have stress-free work environments. Theoretically, it could be a very, very small subset of companies that suffered greatly from this, but that doesn't seem to be very likely. It's probably something we all need to focus on to some degree, even if we are in the better end of the spectrum in terms of managing mental health and stress. So keep in mind that the first step in this is accepting that it's something we all workplaces need to focus on to some degree. But then what does NFA, the Danish Science Association for Workplace Environment, suggest as good solutions? So what is the problem, and what are they actually recommending we could do to combat this? The first thing they recommend is to take the pulse on the organization in terms of stress. And those of you who know me know that I think that's a great idea. But they actually laid out a framework and they divided it into, are you doing this for scientific studies, or are you using this in a real workplace context? And if you go and say, we want to take the pulse or learn more about the stress situation in our organization, the questionnaire that they propose is almost 90 questions. Almost 90 questions, which is borderline ludicrous to expect organizations, and you certainly cannot call it taking a pulse. That's a full fucking body scan. And that would require maybe even an hour from each employee to do. One of the next suggestions is that you follow up on whether the results and whether you're progressing. Another really, really hard thing if it requires that much effort to do the analysis in the first place. Those of you who know me know that also that Soya's, our platform, monitors stress. And even if you look to well-known organizations like WHO, the World Health Organization, they have a framework that's much leaner. 5 questions. That's actually pretty good at measuring stress levels. And doing it more frequently, I certainly believe, is a much more efficient route. Having something automated that actually takes the pulse on a regular basis in terms of how is stress going. Is it the young people? Is it the older generations? Is it all the people that are working more remote? Is it unevenly distributed among gender? Where are the problems, and where are the problems the biggest? That's something you can answer, but I would certainly suggest you look in different directions than the framework and the questionnaire laid out by NFA. Then how does this relate to other things? How does this relate to well-being? How does this relate to psychological safety? Because they do talk about having a sort of a safer space at work as one of the key challenges, at least some of the other people that they interviewed for the main article. So they basically, this is a senior scientist at NFA that says to ensure a good psychosocial work environment, or by doing that, you can really lower the cost of stress. Probably true. Stress, though, as we see it, and we have tracked this for many years across thousands of employees on a monthly and recurring basis, we can see that well-being, stress, and probably also psychological safety is very closely correlated. So by measuring each of them, you'll get nuances into how to work with them. For example, is workload like a predominant driver of stress in your workplace, on your teams? That's questions you can dive into when you go deeper. But they are so closely related that if you do well-being surveys today, or more psychologically well-being oriented engagement measures, then you probably already have a decent proxy, at least, for whether there is a challenge with stress in your workplace. Moving on from that, the article points to a couple of things that could be the reason for this, or at least could be some of the challenges. One of them being that leaders today, they need more empathy. And I think in this whole conversation about empathy, it's important to distinguish between what is, at least in scientific surveys, like circles, often referred to as cognitive empathy versus emotional empathy. So cognitive empathy is whether you are able to predict or simulate or play out how people are going to react to different behavior. So if I say this, then I know that this other person is going to feel bad or not like what I'm saying, for example, or react like this. Emotional emotional empathy is more geared towards whether you would feel the pain that they would feel after you said the fact. So this it can be a very strong driver of doing the right thing, but sometimes it probably also leads managers, executives, HR people to not do the thing that would be the rational, the right thing to do. Just like you're going to have to suffer the fact that your kids are going to be angry when you don't give them candy Monday and Tuesday night. But it might be the right thing for them to not eat candy all the time to build a healthier behavior. Like very hard, or very candid at least, and honest, constructive feedback. So empathy could be part of it, at least part of the solution. I definitely don't believe that it's part of what's causing this negative trend, because I don't see any evidence for the fact that managers should have gotten less empathetic over the past 20 years. And it's very much over the past at least 13, 15 years, we've seen a pretty big increase in stress among employees. So it seems like a very, very unlikely reason for the increase in stress. It could certainly be part of the solution, but there's a big difference there. So the other thing is, when you look at that and you say stuff like that many of the managers today don't have the skills for that. So actually it's laid out like the people that they say, and I paraphrasing, quoting, because I'm translating it from Danish to English, but the people you turn into managers need to have some personal traits, some specific personal traits. You can't teach that on a course. And it's very much to do with the emphatic skills of that person. And they need to be able to look at their employees and know when they are misthriving or when there's something wrong. Very interesting. I published a poll on my LinkedIn profile the other day where I asked what is the primary reason for poor leadership. And actually the vast, not majority, but like there were 4 options, and one of them got nearly half of all answers, and that was that most managers don't have it in them. They are not built of the right stuff, basically, to become good managers, either because they don't have the EQ or the empathy, or maybe the motivation, which could be tied together, maybe not. But that is, it points to a solution where if you can't be trained, if you cannot elevate their EQ, if you cannot motivate them to be good leaders, which I believe to a large extent you can, then we need to replace them. That's an interesting thing to bring up in general, whether we would need to replace more of our managers. There's certainly been, and always has been, this false narrative that good employees, like the best individual contributors, become the line managers or the managers or the leaders of different departments. And I think Google, for example, has some very strong evidence that if you aren't good within your field, within the department or the skill or the capability you're working in, it will be hard to be a really good manager. So the personality traits probably won't be enough to be great, but it might be enough to ensure that we don't have poor leaders. Again, there's an asymmetry to those things that are really interesting to discuss and that I hope to also discuss in the future with other guests. They actually state in the article that workload doesn't seem like the likely cause, and that is something we need to really understand, because workload, like the average amount of hours a person works in most of the Western world, certainly in Denmark, has decreased slightly over the past 20 years. So we work less today than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So when you have a curve going downwards in terms of working hours and a stress curve that is increasing, there's also ways to be careful with correlation and causality, but it's very unlikely that it's the amount of work, like the pure raw amount of work, that hours of work, that is the large contributor to the stress situation. I think more likely it's the lack of focus on simple good health, which is also, I think, heavily caused by the increase in screen time. So when you look at the younger generation and you look at the correlation between hours per day that they spend having a screen in their hand, and let me remind you, they don't work on a computer. So these hours are purely consuming content of different types, or at least largely. There is an incredibly strong correlation for after you surpass 2 to 3 hours of screen time per day, then it significantly looks like it's affecting mental well-being and mental health in a negative effect. And I think many adults as well are lying with their phones all the time, constantly distracted, constantly being stimulated, and that overstimulation, I think, is a large part of why so many people are struggling with mental health, also in a workplace context. But we'll also have stress experts on in the future to help guide me and you guys through this. It's just to say, I think it's very unlikely that this increase is stemming from poor leadership, because I don't think leaders are worse today than they were 20 years ago. I also want to state that it seems very unlikely that it's the amount of work, because we on average work less today than we did 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, all of the above. It's not decreased a lot, but it has decreased a little bit, whereas stress and poor mental health has increased a lot. So those are some of the things I wanted to cover today, but also back to what we can do. So I agree in principle with the NFA in terms of some of the things we need to do. We need to stop being afraid of having the conversation. Putting your head in the sand and not talking about stress won't make the problem disappear. You might risk a little bit by bringing up the conversation, because suddenly you are accountable. Suddenly you might need to do something now that you've opened the conversation and let people voice their opinion, voice their concern, voice all the struggles the organization might be suffering from. But that is so much better than keeping it in the dark and not knowing how to navigate it, who to navigate it with, where to focus on it, because it's very rarely a cross-company challenge. It bubbles up as a key challenge in different teams at different times. And that is why I would also urge most companies to start monitoring and tracking this in a simple, intuitive way, much more frequently. And of course, again, those of you who know me and what we do, we found a monthly frequency to be great. It's not so frequent that employees and managers are overwhelmed by the amount of data and feedback they get, but they actually get a really good habit of looking at this, evaluating whether to invest in this, and seeing whether there is something they need to be very aware of, or whether there are simply some a little bit of turmoil that is pushing things in the wrong direction, or whether it's actually going better, because it's also very hard to know when you have solved the problem. Imagine you're a manager. Imagine you get a report showing that employees in your organization, on your team, is several of them are suffering from high stress levels. Knowing when that is solved based on the conversations, the dialogue, the initiative that you put in place, or maybe the workload that you decrease, or whatever it might be, is very hard to feel. And that is where I also disagree with the level of empathy. I have yet to meet a manager that can fully feel how the team is doing. They might know when things are wrong, but they don't know when things are going in the wrong direction. Not always, certainly not with how busy their day is and everything else that they have to be aware of. So have protocols, tools, data in place to help your managers, help your organization navigate some of these things. And then consider having a stress alarm. That sounds very, it sounds like it can be a bit much. I certainly agree with that from an outside perspective. But the way we handle it, for example, is that when an employee scores high or very high on stress, we automatically follow up with a few questions, again, recommended by the World Health Organization, that helps us be accurate in our predictions to actually know that they are in a difficult situation right now and we should take action. But we do it anonymously. So how do we bridge that? Well, what we do is we send an anonymous email to them, making them aware, not that they are stressed, because this is not a clinical diagnosis by no means, but that it seems like they have a lot on their plate. And we urge them to have a conversation with their nearest manager, their direct report. And if that doesn't feel like a good solution, because that is the solution most stress experts will recommend, that is the place where the conversation can be the most productive, the most constructive and fruitful. But if that isn't a good solution because the manager might be the one punking them to meet deadlines and stressing them out, then we have a consent system. They click a consent button and we let someone from HR or people in culture or some other contact person know that they want to have a conversation without sharing their data or their answers. But just bridging the gap to make sure we can have that conversation. And I think movements like that, things like that, technology like that, can really ensure that managers, both the ones that are highly empathetic and the ones that are not, have a much better chance of navigating when to be more aware, when to invest more in these topics, because we also see many teams, many departments, even some companies that don't have that don't suffer from these challenges at all. But you never really know unless you measure it. And that is a paradigm change. And you certainly should not use a survey that is 88, nearly 90 questions, because your employees will never get through that. You'll never have a broad array of answers. You'll never be able to measure that on a continuous basis to know when things are sliding in the wrong direction or when things are actually moving in the right direction and when you've solved some of these challenges in specific teams. So unless there are any questions, this was all I wanted to share here on this fine Friday. Get the People and Culture show kicked off. I hope there were no weird technicalities or configurations that I didn't figure out. And let's meet inside the podcast apps, and hopefully we'll get to do a lot of cool shows with some cool guests in the future as well. So let me just check here. Maybe I can see them, maybe I can. I'm not sure, but it would be interesting to know. I'll just try to refresh.